Welcome along. It's a recorded interview for you today, dear viewers. And this is something that is, as I promised to do before, something of a revisiting of an issue that this channel first got started covering a number of years ago now, back in the days of the dark days of 2020. Where we started the audio version of this show talking about COVID regimes, and the various different political reactions therein. And one of the people who we followed back then, who was standing out from a crowd of people on the American left who were very enthusiastically embracing lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and just about anything else that the American federal or local bureaucracies could dream up, was of course our guest today, which is Jenin Younes, who joins us all the way from Washington, D.C. Jenin, welcome to the
Thank you.
program.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I followed you back in 2020, 2021, because, as I said, amongst those identified as leftists in the United States, you stood out because you were one of the few who were consistently opposing various different measures that the US government was imposing upon the population. And what we want to talk about with you tonight is the fact that you have been consistent in defense of democratic rights, constitutional freedoms inside the United States, both when it came to COVID several years ago, and also up to the moment now with the Trump administration's assault on democratic rights and clamp down on free speech, which is being loudly cheered on by people who opposed such things when the Biden administration was doing it. So this is interesting ground to cover, but I think I wanted to start by just asking you if you wouldn't mind just elaborating where your politics stood before COVID broke out and the COVID regimes came into play.
Sure. So I generally considered myself on the left. I always had, or long had, some differences of opinion with sort of most people on the left. I was more staunchly free speech, and this sort of safetyism mentality had crept in on the left, I would say since like 2015 or so. Um, where it was really, if speech hurts somebody, we have to consider censoring it, and I thought that was very dangerous. I had some differences of opinion, especially on like trans women issues. I thought like trans women shouldn't be able to necessarily use the same bathrooms, like there have to be some safe spaces for women. So I had some breaks and with the left, and the tolerance level of the people around me on the left was not high for my
Hmm.
differences of opinion. So I did sort of start to think they were a little bit authoritarian, but generally, I felt more on the left than on the right. And then when COVID happened, I immediately disagreed. I was like, this is a huge, huge step to take, shutting down the entire economy. What's this going to do to poor kids? I was a public defender at the time, so I was surrounded by leftists, New York public defender, a very, very left wing environment.
Hmm.
And I worked with a lot of poor families who had like 10 people. It's very common for poor families to live like 10 people to a house, maybe
Hmm.
or apartment, 1 or 2 bedrooms. And I was sort of picturing like kids trying to learn in that environment. Parents, who most likely were working class and would still have to go to work because the working class is still working. And I just saw
Hmm.
it as very classist, and I didn't understand why there wasn't more debate. And I was very troubled by the fact that dialogue on the subject was immediately shut down, kind of using this safetyism discourse. Like, we can't even talk about this or people are going to get hurt.
Hmm. Yes, it was a very similar situation in Britain and much of Europe with the left becoming not just in favor of shutdowns and lockdowns, but hysterically so, to the point
Yeah,
where it couldn't even be discussed.
that's true.
So the way in which the lockdowns and the COVID regimes were rolled out depended heavily upon like a very strict censorship of information with even quite like legitimately very tr things that are actual facts being clamped down upon and being called like right-wing talking points.
Yeah,
So for instance, the effectiveness of like the lockdowns, you've already pointed out the glaring contradictions in them inside the United States, and it was true here
yeah,
as well, which is that like people, poorer end working class people who worked in like retail distribution professions like that were being told, no, you've got to go in.
Yeah.
And they didn't seem it did they did it did it seemed like most of the left was either ignoring it or just demanding basically like performative things to be done for them. So, for
Yeah.
instance, like the unions in this country were demanding like more masks and more ventilation and things like that, which didn't really seem to do a lot, but seemed to like make it look as if they were doing something. So,
Yeah.
like it seemed that there was what came out into the open was this huge disconnect between the professional layers of like activists and NGO people and the people they claimed to speak for in the
Yeah.
working class. Was that the same that you experienced?
Exactly the same. So we call it here sort of the laptop class. You know, it
Mm.
benefited the people like me who could work from home. And frankly, it was very nice for me. I didn't have to go to the office anymore. I still got paid. But I recognized that like restaurant workers were going to be really in, bad shape. Like, what are we going to? And I mean, you talked about the censorship, which is a main issue I've been involved with, a huge issue I've been involved with respect to COVID. And part of the problem is that people really didn't know the facts. So the death rate was very exaggerated, and scientists who were sort of pushing back and saying, actually, it looks like maybe it's not as deadly for healthy young people as they're claiming, were censored. And so people didn't have the information to make decisions and to contribute to the political process in the way that they ought to have.
Hmm. Yeah, that's certainly the case, and the censorship regime that was brought in, or perhaps amped up under COVID. According to your analysis, is this something that was just invented around COVID, or is this a an amping up of something that was already there and that certain interested parties in the state machine were looking for an opportunity to expand?
I think the latter, if I were going to boil it down, and I think there were sort of two ways in which it worked. There's sort of informal censorship, which is maybe more like cancel culture, where
Hmm.
the New York Times just doesn't print alternative views. If you try to say, maybe we should think harder about lockdowns, you're a granny killer. So that's
Hmm.
not actual government censorship. But I've been extremely involved in the government coercing and pressuring and otherwise convincing social media companies to censor what they called misinformation about COVID, anything that departed from the government narrative, and that's real. That is censorship. In the United States, under the First Amendment, the government can't use private parties to do what it can't. And it cannot directly censor people for expressing certain viewpoints, so it also can't use third parties to do that. And so that was sort of the more formal censorship regime. And in both cases, I think they were taking advantage of structures that were already in place. So the sort of safetyism culture I mentioned earlier, where it's like even
Hmm.
discussing things is dangerous. We can't discuss things because it might hurt people's feelings or, it might cause people to do things that will harm other people. The cancel culture, I think, latched onto that mentality. And then the more formal censorship apparatus, what took advantage of the fact that I think some government agencies had already been working with social media companies to censor certain kind of speech, but it wasn't that much. It was
Hmm.
limited. And so that they sort of took advantage of those relationships and those structures and really clamped down to the point where you really couldn't talk about possibly the side effects of the vaccine or that kind of thing anymore without getting censored.
Hmm. Yes, and the this was again loudly cheered on by like a whole range of people who you would be if you were feeling generous, you would describe them as intellectuals. If you were feeling ungenerous, you would describe them as wannabe influencers.
Yeah.
Which, as you correctly point out, like the actual interrogation of the facts regarding COVID, regarding risks to different sections of the population, and regarding like the effectiveness of the control measures, like this was all dismissed. And I wanted to get your opinion on like with regard to like the fact that the American left supported the censorship regime so viciously and it kind of married it up to cancel culture. How much of that do you think was down to like their extreme and I think like wildly over the top reaction to the first Trump presidency, in that they seem to see this as a way they could sort of whack the Trump administration continually.
It's the best explanation I can come up with.
Mm.
Trump actually wasn't even great on this. He pushed lockdowns at the beginning. He was the one who implemented Operation Warp Speed, which developed the vaccines. And I'm not saying the vaccine shouldn't have been developed, not at all. But
Mm.
You can't really call him an anti-vaxxer.
No.
But but he did have some trepidation. He certainly like voiced concern about the economic costs of locking
Mm,
down. And you know, there was this idea, I don't know if you had it in the UK too, like people care about the economy instead of people's lives, as though those things aren't inextricably intertwined. You know,
mm.
if
Yeah.
you shut down the economy, that hurts people's lives. So I think he was seen as not taking it very seriously, as being more concerned about the economy than people, and that I I see it as that the Democrats, who I'm not terribly fond of, took an advantage of that and used it for
Mm,
their political advantage. And you know, they present themselves as more concerned about the working class and about people, but they're not any more than the Republicans. They're just a little better at pretending to be. Um, but on the other hand, I'm not sure. I'm curious what your thoughts are because I'm not sure how that explains other countries. Like that explains the United States, but it doesn't explain why
mm.
all these other European and other countries went along with this.
Well, to answer your question specifically about Britain, I think there are some similarities in that we had gone through a certain amount of what is generally referred to as populism, and like populism in the United States was represented by like Sanders for a while,
Yeah.
and also like the what's described as the right-wing populism of Trump. And we had like the Brexit referendum, and then there was the Corbyn era of the Labour Party, which is not completely an analogous with Sanders, but there are similarities there. And then we had the Boris Johnson Conservative government coming in well, being elected in 2019, which left a lot of people in the left activist class bereft and disappointed and angry. And I think that there'd also been years and years of like public sector cutbacks. And for a lot of leftists, they saw the COVID events as an opportunity to, first of all, hit a government that they despised, and essentially use very emotive terms like "you're killing Granny," etc. That was literally like a line that was used a lot
It was
to
here too.
yeah, yeah, and to damage that government as much as they possibly could. And don't get me wrong, Boris Johnson, I think, was a disaster for many, many different reasons. But the the consistent the consistent focus of what I would call like the middle class left, like like your academics, people who work in like scientific and technical professions. A lot of leftists in this country, like middle class leftists, work in the legal profession. All of them are quite influential in the what in Marxist terms we refer to as like the public sphere, and like they all combined together to like whip up the most hysterical fear they possibly could because they saw it as a political opportunity to
Yeah.
hit Johnson early on to destabilize his government, and he did a pretty good job of destabilizing it himself, to be completely honest.
Uh,
And I think, more broadly, in Europe, like the leftist layers who like been disappointed by various failed political experiments over the previous 10 years since
mm,
really the 2008 financial crisis and the long-lasting effects from that. I think they saw an opportunity to try and reverse some losses
mhm,
by damaging right-wing political forces by in our case it was some people really thought they could reverse cuts to like the healthcare budget
mm,
without analyzing like what the healthcare system is and how money gets drained out of it by various bureaucracies and corporate interests. So just getting a budget increase doesn't really do a lot to
mhm,
reverse damage. And what it revealed, I think, for us was that a lot of people had let desperation and emotion override inquiry. And they were seizing on anything they possibly could to damage who they perceived as their enemies. And because a lot of these people are completely disconnected from the site of production, from the site of work, they didn't see the damage they were actually doing or didn't care.
yeah. Yeah.
And so that's my interpretation on it. I wondered if you had any further thoughts on those lines.
No, I mean it seems extremely similar to here. So
Mm.
yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just go into like the sort of legal side of this for a moment, if you wouldn't mind, because like the question of like lockdowns in the United States, I mean, is a slightly different system over there because obviously you have a written constitution, which is people can raise legal challenges based on that. We don't over here. But it seemed that what the US government was trying to do was to enforce things like lockdowns via really sort of suggestions and sort of threats that weren't perhaps legally backed up, but which they presented very forcefully to lower levels of government and to employers as this is legally enforceable. And to actually take legal action to prove that wrong was required resources that a lot of workers didn't have. So over things like the vaccine mandate, for instance. So I wondered if I
Yeah.
could get your reflections on that.
Yeah, there's an extent to which it's true. I mean, there was quite a bit of enforcement actually, depending on where you were. Lots of people in the
Mm,
New York area where I was living at the time were penalized, fined for trying to keep their businesses open, that kind of thing.
mm,
I think that most people did go along with these things, and that was a lot of what the governments relied on. I mean, here the federal government has a lot less power to do these kinds of health-related measures than the states. So
mm,
most of the measures were implemented by state and local governments. And courts, for the most part, upheld those kinds of mandates because
mm.
the 10th Amendment of our Constitution gives really a lot of latitude to the states to do what they think is necessary to protect the health and welfare of their citizens. And for the most part, courts don't love looking at scientific evidence. You know, they're like,
Mm.
courts, we don't want to look at whether the vaccine stops transmission or whether the
Yeah.
lockdowns are stop, you know. So there's a lot of deference given to state and local governments in that regard.
Yes, I mean, just to, the comparison with here is that the a lot of it was done via like unaccountable bureaucracies. So like we have an awful lot of a forever mushrooming bureaucratic state here that really sort of ran these things with the elected representatives sort of just sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah.
And with people like Boris Johnson, the man who was supposedly running the government, sort of just being pushed around by events. And so that sort of leads me to my next point, which is that like the so-called experts, the expert class, if you will, like were held up as like the people to trust. I mean, the notorious Dr. Anthony Fauci becoming globally famous due to his I don't know what, squinting or sneering at Trump every now and again and being declared a hero by like Rolling Stone magazine and things like that. But having read like the book by Scott Atlas, who was involved with the Trump administration's response, and some other accounts of like the atmosphere in the White House, like it seems that like what the people held up as like authorities on science weren't. And in actual fact, that people like Fauci, Birx, and others were long-term bureaucratic game players who saw
Yeah.
every national crisis in the United States as an opportunity to expand power for themselves and also their budgets. But these were hailed by even like supposedly alternative media as, oh my God, we should listen to Fauci, not the terrible Trump, not the terrible, Ron DeSantis or people like that. Um, so how did you view this at the time? Was it a revelation to you that so many of the people in the senior scientific and advisory positions weren't actual scientists at all, or was it something that you sort of expected?
No, I had no idea. I didn't know how any of this worked.
Mhm.
And I would say this was sort of really my entree into realizing a lot of these things. So, I mean, when I immediately had sort of a visceral negative response to the notion of lockdowns and a lot of the mandates and thought these were just really bad ideas for, you know, various reasons, uh, it sort of started, a light bulb started to go off. I sort of did think that there was this ruling class that knew better, that they protected us, that there were people I could trust. And I realized, no, I mean, I can't. These people have no idea what they're doing. And it was very apparent to me. And then more and more, I just realized, you know, they lie, they're interested in their own power. And I mean, you talked about the power of the bureaucracy there, which was very true here. So, I
Mm,
mean, we had state and local governments, but making decisions, but a lot of the decisions were made by their health departments, who are composed of unelected bureaucrats. And then At the federal level, a lot of the state and local governments were just implementing whatever guidance the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, recommended. And this was a huge issue on the legal front because you can't challenge CDC guidance because it's just guidance. It's not like a
Mm,
law or a rule. But all these jurisdictions would say, well, the CDC says everyone should get vaccinated, so we can mandate the vaccine.
mm,
And so you couldn't challenge that in a court of law, but so there was really nothing you could do.
mm.
To stop the states from saying, well, we're relying on this guidance. And it was very clear to me. I like had a lot of time because everything was locked down. So I would like look at this study, and I didn't have children that time. So I would read the studies, and I was just like, this doesn't say what it says or I could see very obvious flaws. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but like, you
Mm.
only studied the period from May to June, and then you
Yeah.
stopped. And then when I look at the period from July to August, well, the cases were trending upwards, and you just cut the study off so that it didn't have to show that.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, so that was like a real aha experience, not a moment, but of several
Mm.
months, sort of just realizing that these people had their own interests, personal interests, professional or whatever it was, and it wasn't really for the people.
Well, yes, and like when because we were just a couple of like out of work podcasters at the time when where we started doing our program, and like we suddenly could get people like Dr. Martin Kulldorff to come on
Mhm.
because literally no other media outlet was speaking to him.
Yeah.
So he's reduced to speaking to like two random like Marxists from Canada and Britain, because like literally everybody else was just screaming, lockdown now, mandates now, etc. But
Yeah.
as part of like the research for that I did back then, like I actually looked at like the record of like the problems with like vaccinations as a whole, which are sometimes effective, sometimes not, which come with a set of drawbacks, so a set of like potential side effects. And this is well known for like anybody who pays attention to like how the pharmaceutical industry operates, which is that it seeks to, of course, maximize its returns and minimize its losses. And it often shortcuts on its studies and its testing procedures. And this was being openly talked about, but suddenly when it comes to the COVID vaccines, all of the misdeeds and errors of the pharmaceutical industry were papered over and forgotten.
Yeah.
The fact that Pfizer junked its own control group, forgotten or not talked about. The fact that it was clear early on that there would be potential side effects related to, the increased risk of heart conditions in certain groups of people. Again, not talked about, forgotten. And it's quite remarkable that like you can have 2 years of everyone screaming trust the science, but
Yeah.
nobody read it.
No.
And it's if I can see it, and I'm just a guy with like I came from like a political science background.
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure loads of other people could understand it, but again, like it seems to be like a grip of like absolute hysteria and refusal to
Yeah.
engage. And I remember the sheer opportunism of the Democrats who, when the vaccine came out, Kamala Harris was asked, "Would you take it?" And I said, "Oh, I'm not taking Trump's vaccine."
Yeah. Yeah.
4 months later, it's Biden's vaccine, and everybody must have it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I wanted to get your reflection on just the fact that like what this revealed in terms of like the inability to actually question what are quite powerful corporate interests and their linkage to like federal government bureaucracies as well. It revealed like a very troubling thing, which is that there is this like real power there based around like the ability to like literally try to compel people to take what are medicines that could be dangerous to them, and that this needed to be like fought in the courts for a long time for
Yeah.
any sort of progress to be made. So I'd like to get your reflections on that as someone who was involved in these things at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear there was a concerted effort between the government, the vaccine companies, and the social media companies to censor, so-called misinformation about the vaccines,
Mm,
and that served as the basis for a lawsuit that I brought on behalf of Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya.
mm,
I just want to be completely clear. I brought a similar lawsuit on behalf of three Twitter users who are less known,
mm,
and it got dismissed. But because I brought that lawsuit, the Attorneys General of Missouri and Louisiana were bringing a lawsuit making very similar claims, and they asked me to join on behalf of Jay and Martin and Aaron Cariotti and a woman named Jill Hines. And it was the same theory that the government had violated their First Amendment rights by coercing, pressuring, coordinating with, colluding with social media companies to censor their speech. And in some ways, I think that the social media companies didn't necessarily want to go along with it, but in some ways, I think they did. It's a little bit complicated. It depends on the company, depends on the specific topic, complicated picture. But the government was very heavy-handed and basically said, you know, you have to censor anything that might make people not want to get the vaccine, including true accounts of side effects. If that might make people anti-vax, and the companies went along with it. They changed their policies and they escalated enforcement of the policies in accordance with the government's demands. And I brought my first lawsuit in March of 2022, so it's been 3 years now. And then the Louisiana, Missouri lawsuit was filed in May of 2022. And we're still in court. We went to the Supreme Court. Yeah, we went to the Supreme Court on an emergency motion and lost. The court didn't address the merits. It's very complicated legalese, but basically said that the plaintiffs weren't the right ones to bring the case because they couldn't show enough of a tie between their censorship and the government's actions, that they may have only been censored as a result of the social media's companies' independent content moderation policies. And you have to show that you were harmed by the party you're suing. We were suing only the government, not the tech companies. But because that was an emergency motion, the standard is higher for the plaintiffs. So we're back in district court trying to prove, trying to sort of fill some of these gaps. Because the Trump administration has indicated that they're going to stop this particular kind of censorship, I'm sure we're going to get to the other kinds of censorship they're very happy to engage in. We may end up, not continuing to litigate this because if the defendant, agrees with us, then there's not really that much to litigate. So we'll see how that works out. But you're absolutely right that there's this sort of very close ties between the government, the companies, the vaccine companies, the social media companies, and they're, in my opinion, really colluding with each other to take away the rights of the average American.
Well, I think that this is pretty well established by now that is exactly what is going on, and I think that it's a nexus of power which should be more well understood, but is apparently not, and we'll come to like how this bleeds over into like other issues in just a moment. But just on the to sort of finish up on the COVID section here, I wanted to ask you specifically about the suppression of the laboratory leak story and the origins of the virus, because this was also like a big censored thing for quite a long time until suddenly the New York Times starts talking about it quite openly, having refused categorically to do so. Now, there's a lot of different theories about this theory itself, but first of all, I wanted just to get your reflection on like, why was it, do you think, that there couldn't even be a discussion about this in like what's referred to as the mainstream media in the United States for so many years until relatively recently?
Well, I think that's pretty clear. And it's that Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, and some others were working to do gain-of-function research. They were giving grants and they were very involved in it. And so the US government was likely in part responsible for a lab leak at the Wuhan lab that started the pandemic. And they definitely didn't want people to know about that.
Yeah.
So, very early on, the New York Times, it was Apurva Mandavelli. She's a sort of well-known science reporter at the Times. She had tweeted that the lab leak theory was racist. Which is, it's odd to me. Like, I don't why is it racist that it originated in Wuhan from an animal, like a wet market, but not from a lab? That doesn't make any sense, but whatever. And so it became just, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're crazy if you thought it came from a lab. And more of the evidence has sort of accumulated that it came from a lab. But not only that, there are emails between Fauci, a guy named Jeremy Farrar at the Eco Health Alliance, a few others, where they are talking about how we think it maybe came from a lab, but we need to make sure the American people don't know this. And the emails say this explicitly. They were produced in response to a FOIA request. That's the Freedom of Information Act, which means like any American can ask for emails from any agency. There are all sorts of ways that the agencies thwart having to respond to the requests, like claiming national security and everything. But occasionally you actually get something. So these emails were produced. There were also various congressional investigations. It's clear what happened. and that these guys were trying to cover their own asses, excuse my language.
Hmm.
And so they didn't want Americans to know about it. And that's, exactly one of the reasons we have a First Amendment is because people, the framers understood, the framers of the Constitution, that the government often uses censorship to cover up its own misdeeds. That's why we have to have open dialogue. So I think it's a very good example of why free speech is important.
Well, it's also like a an issue which has been expanded upon by recent events, well, events over the last 3 years, which relates to the US government's involvement in an international chain of biological research laboratories,
Right.
including the one in that the NIH was funding in China. Quite why the Chinese government thought this was a good idea is a question for them. But also, we have evidence of various activities going on inside Ukraine, which Victoria Nuland admitted to in a hearing with Marco Rubio, who's now Secretary of State. There's evidence that under the Obama administration, that things that were not allowed to be done inside the continental United States were outsourced and offshored,
Mhm.
essentially. And again, this was fairly well established, but then suddenly it couldn't be talked about. And I think it is
Yeah.
exactly for the reason that you say, and which is that they don't want the level of misdeeds that are going on in these places to be talked about at all, especially not
Yeah.
when it led to this, it potentially led to this whole disaster unfolding, and the origin was with a US government agency ultimately.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, and of course, Fauci is now retired, hasn't he? He's
Yeah.
walked off into a very well-paid public speaking career.
That's right. And Joe Biden pardoned him, so he's not gonna.
Of course, of course.
Yep.
So this is a sort of a point where our interview will pivot because, as I said in my introduction, one of the reasons why we wanted to speak to Jenin is because she occupies like a pretty much almost unique position
Mhm.
amongst like people who have taken a critical line on COVID and censorship and the legalities around that, but also now has taken a line on the question of the struggles of the Palestinian people for nationhood that has put you at odds with people who declared you an ally like previously. So the way that the COVID debate played out, both in America and in Britain, was that it was people who, generally speaking, on the right or who were libertarians of some description, who were leading like the opposition to that, and then you get to a certain point, or you get to the point of October 2023, when October the 7th attack, operation, whichever way you want to put it, occurs. And almost to a man and woman, all of those people turn around and declare that not only is it right to for Israel to do whatever the hell it wants to do, but that also you can't talk about, you can't criticize it, you can't raise anything in opposition to that. So I wanted to start this part of the interview by asking you that about your own position on the Palestinian national question. Like, can you talk about like what your politics are on that and like what informs that?
Sure. I'll try to keep this short. It might be hard, but so my father's Palestinian, which obviously informs my viewpoint. He grew up in the West Bank near a city named Jenin,
Mm,
and he immigrated to the United States when he was in his 20s, where he met my mother. He was doing a PhD program in linguistics. I grew up hearing my father's stories of growing up in the West Bank under the Israeli occupation. That was hugely influential to me. I mean, for people who don't know, Palestinians in the West Bank basically have no rights since 1967, since Israel occupied them. You can just be killed or imprisoned or anything without any due process or, the government, not the government, the Israeli, the
mm,
Israeli forces can do whatever they want to you. The travel is very difficult. You have to go through checkpoints, even often to get to work or to get to the next village to visit your family. So life is, it's brutal,
mm.
and it's only gotten worse over the decades. It's sort of things have escalated. There's been more Palestinian resistance, which has made things worse. So that certainly has a huge impact on my views. I always like to challenge myself, so I read the other side. I read the arguments on the other side. I consider the views. I don't want to just be biased based on my, the perspective I grew up with. I've come to the conclusion that the perspective I grew up with was right. And that's not to say like I don't think the Palestinians as a whole have done anything wrong. Um, it's almost a silly phrase to use. People always say that stuff like, "Oh, the Palestinians, didn't agree to this whatever offer of a state, so therefore it's okay for us to kill a 15-year-old." I don't, that argument is
Mm.
ridiculous. But most of the arguments that favor Israel's reaction to October 7th, I think, are based on very collective notions of guilt, which are at odds with classical liberalism, which says you don't punish people for the wrongdoing of other people, even if they share their ethnicity. The situation in Gaza, Israel always says that they withdrew from Gaza in 2005, and it's true in a sort of technical sense. There are no longer an occupation, and the Israeli settlements were taken out, but they control the airspace, they control the borders, they control people's economic lives, their ability to access medical treatment, education, all of those things. So Gaza is it's strangled economically. It's a difficult place to live. And I'm not excusing October 7th. I don't think attacks against civilians are ever warranted. Not a fan of Hamas. I'm sort of an agnostic, so
Mm.
Islamic extremism isn't my thing. But I think you have to look at things in context, and that just killing a lot of people or trying to drive them out of the land that they're attached to and that they're from and where their family is and their communities are is not the answer to this. So I would say that's my perspective in a nutshell, insofar as I can summarize it.
Yes, and I think it's important to just draw on one of the things you're mentioning there, which is if you're a Palestinian living in the West Bank, never mind Gaza, which was turned an open air prison, but a Palestinian living in the West Bank basically has almost no rights at all.
Yeah.
The Israeli state can do anything it wants to you in terms of arbitrary detention, in terms of imprisoning Palestinians, often very, very young Palestinians, children, in fact, for many, many years. We've seen under the terms of the rather shaky deal that's still in place, just about people being released who've been in prison for decades, often for very, very minor infractions. And I mean, the audience to this program will probably not people who need me to sell them on this, but I would always ask anybody who's in two minds about it to imagine what living under that or growing up under that sort of very oppressive regime and knowing that they can literally kill you and suffer no consequences. Like there's a series of Palestinian journalists in the West Bank, not even talking about Gaza, who have been killed over the years, no consequences for the
Yeah.
Israeli forces who do that. And so growing up under that is something that those of us in the West, even those who have perhaps at certain points been detained by the authorities, been arrested, had run-ins with the state forces, they even at the worst the times in British history or American history, there's still an element of limits on their power.
Yeah.
They can't just kill people en masse at random and always get away with it. Thankfully, but that's the reality of life for people in the
Yeah.
West Bank and Gaza. So with the position that you hold on Palestine, suddenly like you run into the political and perhaps personal difficulty of people who'd really admired and promoted your work when it comes to the COVID question, suddenly doing a 180 and like declaring themselves not in favor of free speech anymore, perhaps not even in favor of the First Amendment applying to questions of Palestinian liberation struggle, or even being able to question the right of the Israeli government to do whatever the hell it wants. This is, of course, maybe standard in many countries all over the world. Like this, everything is defined by partisanship. But was it surprising to you that having gone through the censorship over COVID, that so many people could then immediately turn around and demand it be applied almost in exactly the same way, or perhaps in even more severe state?
It was somewhat shocking. I'll say there was an escalating. I actually want to sort of backtrack a little bit to right after October 7th, where so I expected that the people I'd worked with during COVID, I knew they were right leaning, but I thought they
Mm,
were rational. And I thought
mm,
they understood, sort of principles of, individual guilt. If one person does something wrong, it doesn't mean you can kill 3,000 people of their ethnicity. I was extremely shocked at the reactions immediately after October 7th. Just like bomb them all, kill them all, raise Gaza. There are no innocent children. All the children are just going to grow up to be terrorists. Just kill them. I was like, these are the people I'm friends with. Like I couldn't believe it. And it's been like 16 or 17 months of just sort of shock. And I've basically, I mean, they hate me now, which is fine.
Mm.
I've just had to deal with quite a lot of like attacks on Twitter and stuff, so I don't want to make this about myself, but it really surprised me. And then when the Trump administration started its crackdowns, which I knew were coming because they had announced these executive orders, and they're sort of multifaceted, so they get at pro-Palestine speech in a few different ways. One is aimed at non-citizens using sort of immigration law to deport pro-Palestine activists. Another is aimed at universities to punish them financially if they don't censor students who engage in pro-Palestine activity. So I had read these immediately. I knew they were coming. So when Mahmoud Khalil was detained, I wasn't actually super shocked. I imagine that I actually was a little surprised they started with someone so sympathetic. If I were in their shoes, and as evil as they are, I would have started with someone who, maybe had actually said something pro-Hamas. Khalil, didn't. He was very peaceful in his rhetoric. And he was on a green card, which gives him some heightened protections. But I actually still, with everything I had been through with these people and seeing how hypocritical they were, and another thing is I thought as right-leaning people, they would think, they have this "don't tread on me" property rights, which a lot of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has involved just, the Israelis taking Palestinians' property. I thought they would understand those things and it would appeal to them. But there's some blind hatred of Muslims and brown people there. I can't explain it any other way. It's just the brown people must always be wrong. And I tried to explain things to them in kind of their terms, like how would you feel if someone came and took your home and said, now you have to go live in a tent? They come up with crazy justifications. They say, get over it, whatever. So I still thought that because they all held themselves out as free speech defenders, I still thought that I would see some principle. And so I was really surprised when they immediately all seized on this. Oh, Khalil is a terrorist. Others like him are terrorists. They've committed crimes. Get them out of the country. And at first, when he was detained by ICE detention, there was some nebulousness around what exactly he'd done. Had he broken rules on Columbia's campus? Had he committed maybe some minor trespass offenses? Whatever. But it became very clear very quickly that he was being thrown in detention and taken away from his pregnant wife just for speech, and not even for terrorist speech. It was clear the State Department was conflating pro-Palestine speech with support for Hamas, very clear. And when they cited the actual statements, it was pro-Palestine. So I'm still a little stunned at this hypocrisy and this defense. And the other thing that kind of strikes me is that most of my friends and family are on the liberal side of the spectrum. So they, when I talked to them about what the Biden regime was doing and the censorship around Biden, they would kind of ignore me. They didn't listen. And now they're extremely up in arms about what Trump is doing. And I'm like, do you understand how the way that you guys have supported chipping away at free speech is now going to be used against you? But they don't see it like that. It's just Trump bad, Democrats good.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can detect that just from the way in which this is written about by people on the US left, which is that they were all doing apologetics for Biden right up and Harris right up until the last minute. So ignoring all the assaults by the Biden administration on democratic rights, which we've just been talking about, but also ignoring the fact that Biden facilitated everything that went on in Gaza and all he armed Israel for over a year, and apparently people were still prepared to vote for him. But you wanted to come in.
Oh yeah, no, the subject gets me so riled up because I didn't vote for Harris, and a lot of my family. I have a lot of sort of boomer family members who are traditional liberals, and they were very angry with me, and I got a lot of emails about how could I, Trump is the greatest threat to democracy, and I was like, this genocide happened under Biden, and Harris has said she's not going to do anything different. Genocide is my red line. I'm not going to vote for it. I didn't vote for Trump. I voted for Jill Stein, but and it doesn't matter anyway because I live in Washington D.C. So so it's a lot of hysteria over nothing in a way. But it really frustrated me to no end the fact that people don't see it when it's their party doing it. And I think, you know, my sort of take on the Democratic Party is that they're not really any less evil than the Republican Party. They just put a nice bow on it and say some nice words, and like they feel really bad when the babies are dying, instead of Trump, who like is very clear he doesn't care if the babies are dying.
Hmm.
And in a way, I think it might be better in the long run to have a Trump presidency. Because he puts it all out in the open. Part of the reason we had trouble in court challenging Biden's censorship was that it was covert. And so we don't have a lot of the information. And the court's basically like, well, if you don't have enough evidence, we're not going to let you get more evidence and discovery. So the fact that Trump just puts this all out there, engages in this clear First Amendment violative conduct, and the fact that he's so nasty and he says, you know, these
Hmm.
crazy things about Palestinians, I think in a way, um, might make change happen more quickly. And it's horrible. And like, you know, the last thing I want is for Palestinians to be pawns in our political chess game.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, that's just the situation. And so I don't ever think, I wish Harris had won. I mean, sometimes I wish Harris had won because I think I'd be less angry right now about the speech stuff. But
Hmm.
I think in the long term, it's not. It's actually probably better that this is all in the open, and maybe it will facilitate change more quickly.
Well, it certainly is a point of view that I am myself sympathetic to, because I think that the thing with like the liberal side of things, and the sort of what I would regard as like the social democratic governments in Britain and Europe, is that they hide their intentions behind a lot of like warm words and
Mhm.
rhetoric about like, so like Kamala Harris during the campaign was constantly doing these things about how she really felt bad for what was going on in Gaza. Like she's you know, oh, isn't it terrible? Like periodically Biden would even be wheeled out to mumble some sort of platitudes about it. And that is all just to dress this thing up. So to make it look other than what it is, which is like direct facilitation of a genocide.
Yeah.
And you got like even the supposed left of the Democrats, the so-called Democratic, so-called Socialists of America candidates like Ocasio-Cortez and others doing the
Yeah.
same thing, like performative nonsense, which is very cynical in terms of the fact
Yes.
that like none of these people, I don't regard them as stupid. So and I think that Ocasio Cortez and people like Bernie Sanders understand what is going on, but they decided to prioritize the re-election of the Democrats over and
Yeah.
above a genocide, which, as you say, like is correctly, that is a red line for many in the
Yeah.
United States right now. But apparently, for like a lot of the people on the organized American left, they were still prepared to swallow it,
Yeah.
just to keep the bad orange man out, basically.
Yeah.
Um, but now the bad orange man is there, doing much of what he promised to do.
Yeah.
It struck one of the things I wanted to get your reflections on was like you've already talked a little bit about like why some people in the American rights response to this was so like fanatical and like pro Israel no matter what. Um, but like, how do they square all of that with like all of their like get America out of like forever wars? You know, we want to prioritize internal domestic problems rather than foreign commitments. Have you seen any rationalization of this, or is this just blind knee jerk, like almost like tribalistic stuff?
Tribalistic. There's an Israel exception for everything, you know, free
Mm.
speech, but the Israel exception. And it just, you know, there's a very strong lobby in this country. A lot of people are just not very informed. And it's sort of these preconceived notions they have in their head, I think, that don't allow them to question this. One thing I will say, I mean, I'm not right-wing person. I don't really know. I don't
Mm.
really know what my politics are at this point. I hate all politicians, I think, except Thomas
Oh.
Massey. Um, but uh, but I know a lot of wing people from my time fighting the COVID stuff. I've become friends with them. And there is a growing contingent on the right who rejects Zionism and rejects
Mm.
our involvement in Israel. And they tend to frame things as, and I talked to a lot of these people privately, and they agree with me on the Palestinian human rights issue, but they think it's much more clever framing, and it's going to resonate with the right to frame it much more as like, America first, we need this money for America. And we, yes, Khalil is a terrorist. He's not,
Mm.
but or Khalil, says terrible things because he is aligned to Hamas, which isn't true. But like we have to defend the First Amendment for Americans, so it's all sort of framed in America terms, which I think is a clever way of doing it, because that's going to appeal to some people who just don't really like brown people, and are
Mm.
like, I
Mm.
just can't. Yeah, but I do. I'm pretty sure there's a growing contingent on the right. I mean, it's hard to like get a statistical sense when you just talk to people randomly, and I know a lot of young conservatives, and every single one of them does not understand the relationship with Israel and doesn't accept it. And they're much more. I think they just grew up with much less racist ideas about Arabs than
Mm.
the older people on the right, and so they just don't accept this.
That's interesting. I mean, I wonder if you're familiar with the old video of then Senator Joe Biden when he was, so we say, more compos mentis, where it's, speaking about the relationship with Israel in quite open and honest terms in the Senate in the 1980s, when he is pretty clear that the reason why he supports Israel fanatically is because he sees it as essentially an extension of American power in either, depending upon your preferred choice of or words, West Asia or the Middle East. And I think for some of them, I mean, this is true in Britain as well, that the most fanatically pro-Israel people in this country certainly aren't Jewish. They are like people who regard it as literally like the last colony.
Yeah,
This is like we get a lot of this in Britain at the moment. Like this is clash of civilization stuff. The West is under siege. We
yeah,
must stand by our glorious defenders in many cases like Tel Aviv and Kiev being the
yeah,
two choices. And my reflection is, well, if that's Western civilization, we've got problems.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
um, but I wondered if there's any sort of reflection on here in inside the United States of this belief amongst like people who defend Israel that they see Israel as literally like an extension of the US almost.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say there's sort of competing there's arguments about whether like we're Israel's outpost or Israel's our outpost.
Mm,
Like are who's the tail wagging the dog? Is
mm,
our government overtaken by Zionist influence and that's why we're doing this, or is it because people in our government really see Israel, our alliance with Israel, as strategically necessary? It's it's pretty clear to me that Israel is, frankly, our support for Israel and a lot of the wars we've gotten into on Israel's behalf is the cause of our problems. I don't think Arabs just hate America. I don't think they just hate the West. As
mm,
someone who has relatives in that region, talk to a lot of Arabs. It's the reason there's antipathy is because of our support for Israel and because we keep killing Arabs and we don't care. We show
mm,
complete disregard for the lives of Arabs. So um, to me, it's much more a cause. It's hard for me to know exactly which it is, but I will say I have a few friends who are neocons. We try to avoid this topic because it results
mm,
in arguments, but I definitely have some friends who see it as very, very important that Israel be our outpost in the Middle East. They think that the Arab terrorists are going to come for us if Israel doesn't keep them under control. I don't think it's true, but it's certainly a strong belief.
mm. Yes, I've had similar conversations going all the way back to my master's degree and arguments with the international relations students of a similar nature. Now, I wanted just to shift focus and to look into the future with regard to like democratic rights and defense of free speech in the United States in this particular period, because I hope our conversation has brought out to viewers. The United States has been going in a more undemocratic, more restrictive path on with regard to free speech for quite some time now. So, are you hopeful at all that there can be some kind of like broad-based campaign to defend constitutional rights to defend the right to free speech, as it is talked about by so many people as a fundamental American value. Is Trump's rather crude assault on this going to result in a positive backlash, do you think?
I can't help being hopeful. It's
Mm,
one of my faults. I think the fact that it's so blatant, it's so obvious what he's doing. They're
mm,
not even covering it trying to wrap it in the veneer of anything that approaches legality. I
mm,
think might be beneficial in the long term. I think Khalil's case is extremely important. It's going to be the first test, really, of whether the administration can just deport people because it doesn't like their views.
mm,
I think the First Amendment is pretty clear. The First Amendment starts with Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. I think it's extremely clear that that's a restraint on government. It's not about the speaker's immigration status. Um, Moreover, it's clear that the intent which of the First Amendment, which is to encourage debate, dialogue, rather than shutting speech down, is favors an interpretation that applies to immigrants and non-citizens as well as U.S. citizens. Um, so to me, the law is clear, the philosophy is clear, the policy
mm.
is clear, and I do have some hope. I've been disappointed by judges many times, but I've never seen a disregard so flagrant. And in fact, I'd say there's really very little precedent for this because it is so flagrant that it just hasn't come. There are a couple cases that sort of mirror it a little bit. There are a couple communist era cases when there was really a lot of hysteria over communism. And they're not great, but they can be distinguished from this situation. And in a way, as I said, it's almost good that they started with this case because if the first case had been somebody who maybe said something like, let's celebrate October 7th, it was a great day, and that's still protected speech in my book, and there are plenty of Israelis who are celebrating what goes on in Gaza every day and say kill more babies. So
Mm.
the disparate application is clear that should. But nevertheless, there would be an easier argument for the government that this is somehow material, or it's not material, but somehow support of terrorism in a way that could fit the national security law. I still think the First Amendment should trump that, but judges too are very emotional and they're human beings, and if they hear something like that, I think they might just want to try to find ways to use the law to justify deporting him. So it's interesting to me that they started with such a sympathetic case, because had they started with something a little bit more on the edge, they might have been more successful.
Mm. So the crudeness of the Trump team might actually be to the advantage of their opponents in this case, then.
That's true. Although
Mm,
then I think they'll learn their lesson if
mm,
Khalil wins, and they're going to start going for visa holders because they're a
mm,
little lower hanging fruit than green card holders, and find people who have said things that are a little bit closer to the line. I think there's a
mm,
woman who actually I think they just deported who had gone to Nasrallah's funeral. They're claiming,
mm.
who even knows if that's true, but um, you know, if Nasrallah is a terrorist, so is Benjamin Netanyahu. So again, like the
Well,
inconsistency in application is not fair, but it's a little bit easier of a case to make to a judge.
mm. We await the International Criminal Court's warrant for Netanyahu being enacted. Final point before we wrap up, Janina, I wanted to give you the opportunity to just talk about your own podcast, which you co-host. It's called Previously Prohibited. Did you want to just mention that before we end here?
Sure, yeah, I just launched it a month or two ago with my co-host Melissa Whitty. She is a little bit different from me, but we agree on Palestine and the lockdowns. She's Christian conservative. I'm a sort of not Christian conservative. We have a lot of interesting guests on, so I hope people tune in.
Okay, and we'll link to that in the show description. But I will end the hour by thanking you for your time today, Jenin. It's been a very interesting conversation. And we hope that you agree to come back at some point in the future when these issues develop further.
Anytime. Thank you.
Thank you very much.